So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's Eloqua user group. For those of you that attend these regularly, Derek normally does a fantastic job with our user group webinars. However, he doesn't officially return from annual leave until tomorrow. So I'm going to be presenting the session to the user group for my first time today. So bear with me a little bit. I shall try and keep this as smooth as possible. So for those who don't know me, let me first introduce myself. My name's Adrian Jones. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Marketing Cube. I've been working with Eloqua and our clients for over 10 years. And the rest of the Eloqua, or the Oracle Marketing Cloud, since Eloqua was acquired in around 2012. So before we kick off, I wanted to mention that we will be reviewing and answering any questions that are posted in that Ready Talk chat window so we'll try and get to those towards the end of the webinar or as we go through the presentation. So please post away, and we'll try and get to those as soon as we can. So again, thank you for joining us. If this is your first Eloqua user group, special welcome to you guys. Our key objective during these sessions is to really help everyone understand what's available to you in the Eloqua platform, and also to enable you to make the most out of your company's investment. And so this session we thought would be really helpful to focus on the GDPR and really how Eloqua can help you. So just before we dive into today's session, what would really help us and help me today would be to just get a quick idea of how you feel or how up to speed you feel you are with GDPR. Let me just pop a quick poll up on the screen, and if you guys can have a quick look and just let me know where you think you're sitting with your GDPR knowledge right now. That would be great. So that's all buildings. We've got quite a few people that have, this is the first they've kind of got into the GDPR. That number's rising. Some people have heard a little bit. There's not too many people that are experts. So that's okay. We're probably in the right place. Okay, so let me jump into what we're going to run through today. So the first thing I thought is just to go back to the real basics of what is the GDPR, what is it all about, and then I'm going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. What are your obligations as a marketer in being compliant? What are the consumer's rights? And so what is it from a consumer's perspective? And then I think importantly, kind of some key reasons around how Eloqua can help you. And then we might have a look at some common myths and go into some FAQs. So my intention with this GDPR presentation was to kind of do all the research and present it to you in a really nice abbreviated format. There are lots of things that Oracle has done with Eloqua that helps you already be compliant. Eloqua itself covers off some of these key areas, so it's good to know what they are. And then there are lots of ways that you can use Eloqua to be GDPR compliant. So I think the most important thing and my key takeaway from my research was that even if these regulations, the GDPR, does not directly apply to you today, it does provide some real insights into how data protection laws and consumer expectations are changing and are going to change. And I think what we'll see over kind of the next 12, 24, 36 months is a change, and that bar in terms of kind of customer expectations of where that is going to be set is going to change. So in many ways, the same way that, sort of seeing that click on to, for cookie notification, you see sort of across a lot of websites now, it's going to be pervasive. So a lot of these regulations are going to go across most global organizations, and you're going to see a lot of this being adopted as kind of best practice. And so that's why I think some insights into GDPR are so important for everybody. Before I go too much further, I do need to say this. So my research basically consisted of kind of there was an Oracle webinar and some resources, some new regulations on the EU site. You can go and read those, and numerous blogs and articles. I'm sure you're seeing them. But I do need to say that this presentation and our content is only a guide, and it's meant for information purposes only. How the GDPR applies to your specific business will depend on your business and how it runs and its location, and some of that stuff you'll understand. And it's not really only all about marketing. There are lots of areas of the business that will also be affected. And so I think our particular focus today is on the marketing viewpoint. The other thing is these regulations are pretty new, and they're not, and they're open to interpretation. So there are, I guess there's some how this will be tested out from a legal perspective is still to be seen, and so we'll need to watch those things, and that's going to be something that happens, over the coming months. And as I said, we are going to focus on a marketing viewpoint of the GDPR. Let's get into some of the fun part, and that is, what is the GDPR? It is the General Data Protection Regulations. That's what the GDPR stands for. And it basically comes into effect on the 28th of May, 2018, not too far away, a couple of months. And it was created essentially to protect EU citizens from privacy and data breaches. And the idea was to establish a number of data-related rights. So why has this come around? So the key thing has been a general consensus among sort of particularly in the EU or in the EU regulators that there's been some pretty poor consent management practices, a number of large data breaches, and also some customers and some people feeling that their data is being exploited. And so this has become, I guess, a general feeling again of a lack of data transparency. And when something happened, there was generally a lack of accountability for when these types of issues arose. So we only really need to consider the hammering that Facebook's taken in recent weeks, just to get a sense of how this respect for data and how the transparency around data and any perceived misuse has an impact on a brand or on a business. And so people really want to know what that data is being used for, and we hear expressions, data's the new oil and it needs to be protected, and people are really conscious now that there's so much that is out there that they really feel that they don't have any control over. So GDPR is really about trying to address that imbalance and try to give the power, if you like, or some of that power around the data back into the hands of individuals and consumers. So what does it do ultimately? Well, it's about protecting consumers, and it's about enabling them to have a right in how their data is used. And it's also to reduce the risk, ultimately. It's designed to reduce the risk of personal data being kind of exploited or misused. And the way that that's going to happen is by having some regulations around controlling the way that data is collected, managed, and distributed. Let's have a look at how the regulations have come about. So the key point here is that this is an evolution. It's not a sudden revolution. So there was a EU-wide data protection directive that was put in place around 1995. All the countries in the EU then basically took that directive and translated it into legislation for their own particular country. So, for example, the UK Data Protection Act is one example of a data protection legislation that was based on that data protection directive. What that meant was that each country kind of had slightly different rules. And so people are familiar with Europe will know that the UK acts slightly differently from Germany, where double opt-in is kind of mandatory, acts slightly differently from other countries. So there was, an interpretation of the directive, and that was put into local legislation. So if you're doing business in Europe, you kind of have to look at each of those different acts and make sure that you're compliant to each of those acts for each country. The other thing is that it was something that was put in place in 1995, which, believe it or not, was pre-Google. So Google was started on the 4th of September 1998. So an awful lot has changed since that directive was first put in place. There's another pillar as well which people need to be aware of, and that's an e-privacy directive, which came around later in about 2002, and that really deals with cookies and some email tracking directives and some more specific consumer email marketing rules for Europe. And this has not been included yet broadly into the GDPR. So that is expected to be a second set of regulations that will probably come out in 2019, and will also add some more, requirements into how those types of things are managed. Because the reason for this slide is to really show that it is an evolution, not a sudden revolution, and most compliant EU companies are already well on their way to GDPR compliance. So it's not sort of suddenly come around all these things that you've got to do. Most people that are dealing with Europe will already be, partly, will already satisfy many of the requirements of the GDPR. So let's take a little bit more of a look into who is specifically impacted by the GDPR. Broadly, it's going to apply to any company, whether or not it is established in the European Union, that collects or handles what's called personal data from EU-based individuals. So what this means is the GDPR applies to you if you provide products or services to European-based customers or monitor European-based individuals despite not being established in Europe. And if we look at it from an Eloqua perspective, if you have contacts in your database that reside in the EU, technically you'll need to comply with GDPR standards. Now, sometimes you might not know. So I've spoken to several of our customers just sort of to see what their GDPR position was, and they're Australian-based, but may have some EU contact. Part of the challenge with that is they may not even know that they are EU-based contacts. So one of the challenges that we have right off the bat is understanding who is in the EU and who we need to be GDPR compliant for and the types of information we're providing to them. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we come to how Eloqua is going to help. But essentially, where you really have to be careful is if you have an office in Europe or if you're an EU-based organization. So let's take a look at what it means if you're not compliant. So just want to have a look at that personal data because that's an important difference. When we're talking about the data that's covered, the GDPR talks about personal data, and that as a concept is significantly broader than what is previously known or what's used in the US, which is personally identifiable information. So that's used in the US information security and privacy laws. And so personally identifiable information includes any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. That means living and not artificial. But anyway, so we're really looking, that's kind of our personally identifiable information. When we're looking at personal information or personal data, it's much broader. So information relating to a business is exempt because that's in reference to a legal entity rather than a person. But if you're in communication with a person or a representative of a business, then data that is exchanged in the context of that relationship will also be deemed to be personal data. So what are we talking about? There are obvious identifiers like first name, last name, email, phone number, kind of business address. But also, there are a number of less obvious identifiers included. So IP addresses, cookie ID number, even device type information could be included or construed to be personal data. So really it's a concept that any information that may be used to single out a specific person, a specific number, device or person could be deemed to be personal data. So that's what we really need to be careful about. So if we look at compliance then, and what happens, well, the fines potential fines for large organizations are considerable. So it can be as large as $30 million Australian or 4% of the company's prior year worldwide revenue. So really significant. One of the reasons that I said you need to be particularly careful if you have an office in Europe, or if your organization is based in Europe, is that the reality is that there aren't many international treaties, and so if you don't have offices there, it's going to be pretty hard from a practical perspective for European regulatory bodies to enforce GDPR and non-compliance penalties if you're outside or based outside the EU. But having said that, the main purpose is, we believe the standards are changing. We believe that this type of regulation is going to become the new expectation. And so moving towards GDPR compliance, even regardless, is going to be something that I think all organizations are going to do. And ultimately, I think it's going to result in some better marketing and some better results. Okay, so that's the legislation. That's kind of the tough part. Now we'll get into a little bit of more about what the GDPR kind of really means to us and get into some of the details. Let's have a look at your obligations as an organization and the implications to you as a marketer. So here they are in kind of 9 easy boxes. So the first is we're obliged to be transparent. So that means that we need to use the data in a transparent way. We need to be transparent about the information that we have. There are individual rights. We need to respect the rights of the individuals and contacts that we have in the database. There's a curious section about establishing a legal basis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on. But essentially, it means that even if you don't have an opt-in, you need to. An opt-in is one way of establishing a legal basis, but there are other ways of establishing a legal basis for an email. Customers, for example, you might already have a legal basis to provide your customers with information regardless of their opt-in status. And that's because you might have a legal obligation to tell them about a change in their contract, for example, or to update them on something that's happened. For example, I don't know, an automotive warning of some kind. But you need to have an established legal basis for your communication. Purpose limitation, what the data is used for. You have an obligation for data quality and retention. So the data quality responsibility sits with you. And then also how you look after that information sits with you as well. So we know that data quality degrades over time. And so that data quality and the actual physical retention is also part of a marketer's responsibility. And should something happen and security is breached for whatever reason, then there's an obligation to let people know that there has been a breach. And you'll see this, you will have seen this more and more. I recently got one from an application that I use on my phone, just saying that, sort of 4 days ago there'd been a breach and all customers were notified of that data breach and what the implications of it were, what the company was doing about it, and sort of trying to have customers rest assured that nothing had happened. So consequently, I need to now go in and change everywhere that has the same password, so that it doesn't go any further. But at least I'm aware, and I can make some decisions and choices about what to do with that application as a result. So that's a good example. And then large organizations that process a lot of data will also need to have a chief data officer. And so that will become a legal requirement in Europe, and that role will come with some responsibility. So that will need to be an appointment. So you need, obviously, if a European-based organization, you'll probably be looking at this already, or you will have one, but one will need to be appointed, and they will have some responsibilities around that. So there's a concept as well around privacy by design and by default. So essentially, our flags are essentially customer. They're going to be opted out unless somebody specifically asks, and privacy all the way through is kind of paramount and needs to be protected. There's some governance and accountability. So we've spoken about some of the penalties and what will actually happen if some of these things aren't, if you're not GDPR compliant and you're operating within the EU. And then there's some restrictions around the data and where the data can be shared and how it can be shared. So going back a little bit to the purpose for which the data was first gathered, doesn't necessarily have to be that, but it does have to be transparent around, and people need to be clear about what they're opting in for and who the data could be shared with. So you'll see a lot more transparency around those data transfers, and it'll be a lot harder for people to collect the information and then say, oh, we sold it to so-and-so, we sold it to so-and-so, and it was hidden in the terms and conditions, and even though you didn't really have a look at them, if the obligation sits with the marketer to make it absolutely clear about how their data is going to be used and if it is going to be unsold. So I think the responsibility is less then with the consumer to try and find out or to try and shut it down, because essentially that gets harder and harder. So if we break this down to make it just a little simpler, there are really 3 key areas that you as a marketer need to focus on. So the first is how you're collecting personal data. Essentially, here's the rules. They need to be, GDPR requires that basically consent, and that opt-in is freely given, so specific, informed, and unambiguous. It means our opt-ins can't be soft opt-ins or implied opt-ins, pre-checked boxes, not going to be looked upon favorably. Marketers will need to clearly indicate what personal data is going to be processed, how it's going to be processed, when, who will process it, and for what purpose. So all of that information around personal data is going to be really important. So how we're collecting it becomes key, and we need to think about that in every process that we have. So We're thinking about forms, thinking about how we run events. We're thinking about what we do at, at a trade show. We're looking at what our salespeople are collecting and how they're collecting it. And the question is consent being freely given, specific? Is it informed and unambiguous? And so that's helping us to be just to make sure we're GDPR compliant in terms of collecting the data. When we get to managing that data, well, essentially, the GDPR now applies to all new as well as all existing data. And if you're requested, you will need to provide detailed proof that you as an organization have consent to use that personal data in the manner for which it is being used, and that is explicitly across each channel. So when people opt in, they're opting in specifically for a type of communication across a channel, and they need to understand how the data is going to be used. Further, it also includes the concept of timeliness and relevance of that consent. So what that means is, you can't take a consent from 10 years ago and say, yeah, this is still valid. And it also needs to be relevant. So we can't say, okay, well, yes, they've opted in for one thing, and so we've opted them in for everything. So we need to make sure that the types of consent and the timeliness of the consent is still valid. And so we'll really need to understand, as a marketing team, what data is GDPR compliant and making sure that it is before sending any marketing communications to any existing databases in the EU now and probably more broadly as this thing takes off. So finally, there's the area of the protection of personal data. And so this sort of falls into a number of areas, some of which I've kind of touched on already. So the first is data security. So companies must implement an appropriate level of security. So that needs to contain sort of technical and organizational controls to prevent data loss and information leaks or any unauthorized data access. Now, I mentioned before, we're looking at this from a sort of a marketing perspective, but really you can see how IT and the broader organization needs to fall in behind this as well, just to make sure. So the GDPR is basically encouraging companies to incorporate encryption and incident management and network and system integrity and availability, all those things that they should be applied so that you've got sort of security around that data. And you're really doing everything that you can to protect the data that you have under your control. There's also data breach notifications. So part of this is to say, you have to inform the regulators, your regulators, and any impacted individuals as soon as you can after becoming aware that their data has been subject to a data breach. So you need to have controls, A, to know that that's going to happen, and B, think about a process for how that's actually going to happen in reality. So if you're not large enough, you don't have a chief data officer, what's that chain of command that says, okay, this is how we do this? Should it happen, what do we have in place to let people know? And what's the message going to be? And how quickly can we actually get that out there? And then finally, there is an expectation around security audits as well. So companies will be expected to document and maintain records of their security practices and audit the effectiveness of that program and actively take corrective measures where appropriate. So you'll see, I think, a lot more of this happening where people are looking at their data, looking at all the different points. And it's a little bit of a chain of command as well, because what's going to happen is that in order for your data to be compliant, you're going to need to look to your suppliers and third parties and make sure that they're compliant as well. And so it's going to go kind of along the whole data chain to make sure that everyone is compliant and everyone has these security measures in place. Which is in fact going to be a huge undertaking for a lot of organizations to kind of go through that exercise. As I said, in the EU, a lot of people will already be doing it, but I think to get ahead, a lot of organizations are going to start doing that globally, and we're going to see that happening because essentially, a data audit or a data breach coming out of Australia is going to be, for a global organization, it's going to have the same impact. So it's really going to become it's going to become a global phenomenon very quickly, if not already. So let's spin this around a little bit. And let's just look at it from the perspective of the consumer rights. And so it's just interesting, put ourselves in the consumer. I'm using consumer as customer, lead, prospect, all the other definitions, essentially of contact in Eloqua. But if we look at all those differences, what are the rights kind of the consumer? And essentially, these are the rights in a nutshell. So the first is the right to access. So it means individuals have the right to request access to their personal data and ask how that data is being used by the company after it's been gathered. So you can request, and you will be able to request, a copy of the personal data free of charge in an electronic format so that people can see what you've got. And so there's been a lot in the news recently about people that have been getting hold of Facebook and trying to get their Facebook file or their Google file and see all the information that those organizations are holding on them. But essentially, you can go to any body that is holding, any organization that is holding your personal data and ask for a copy. You have the right to be forgotten. So if consumers are no longer customers, for example, or if they withdraw consent, they essentially globally opt out, essentially that could be the same, it could be deemed the same way, they have the right to have their data deleted. So you're no longer able to hold the data of organizations, the personal data of individuals that have requested that their data be deleted. And they also have the right to data portability, so the right to transfer their data from one service provider to another, and it must be in a commonly used and easy to read format. So yeah, quite a lot involved, but basically it means that over time, or if explicitly stated, individuals do have the right to be forgotten, and we know that we're able to transfer that data, and we need to manage the fact that that person has requested that. They have the right to be informed, which covers any gathering of data by companies and individuals, so they have to be informed that the data is being gathered, and consumers have to opt in for their data to be gathered, and as I said before, that consent has to be freely given, rather than implied. So the next one is the right to have their information corrected. So again, this ensures that individuals can update their data if it's out of date, incomplete, or incorrect. So that means that they can go through that process easily. Again, something for larger organizations with multiple repositories, this is tricky, right? So you might have different databases and different repositories. If those repositories aren't synced, you can try time and time again to update my information with a particular brand, only to find that it still comes through incorrectly. As far as the consumer is concerned, that brand's not really understanding or hasn't serviced that request. They may have serviced that request, but only to one part of the organization, not to all the others. And so this kind of single customer view then really comes into play with how we manage and are able to correct this information. So you tell one part, the other part to know that the information has been updated. There's also a right to restrict processing. So individuals can request that their data is not used by a particular organization in a particular way. So the record can still remain in place and not be used. So sort of like an unsubscribe, essentially, do not process my information, but I want you to remember that I'm unsubscribed. Finally, we've got two more. The other is the right to object. So that's the right of individuals to stop the processing of their data for direct marketing. Essentially, this is one of the big ones within the regulations, and essentially there are no exceptions. So any processing must stop as soon as a request is received. This right, the ability to opt out, must be made clear to individuals at the very start of any communication. So once you have that communication chain, you've got to make it really clear that they do have the option to opt out or to object. And finally, the right from the consumer perspective to be notified. This is going back to the data breach. So if there's any data breach which compromises an individual's personal data, remember all those things we spoke about that sort of fell into that personal data category, the individual has the right to be informed within 72 hours of that organization first becoming aware of the breach. It really does come down to understanding our contacts' preferences and consent, being able to understand where they are. What this will in turn enable us to do is to build trust with our prospects, trust with our customers, and essentially in the long run, that's going to help us to build more effective campaigns and a better customer experience that matches what our consumers are hoping that we're going to do. I believe ultimately it's going to improve our marketing results. Let's have a look at our next poll and throw the question out there. So to what extent do you think Eloqua is going to help you with all of this? Thank you for everyone who's tapped in some answers. And it's good that people have got some good ideas around how Eloqua is going to help. But still quite a few people that are unsure. So that's good too. So what I'm going to do is I've kind of identified some areas where Eloqua can really help you. Let me run through some of those with you now. So the very first one, there's 10 of them. The first one is keep your customers and prospects informed. So here's the top thing is GDPR changes do represent a major change in regulations. And it's a major change for potentially your customers and prospects, but also they're going to find out about some of these changes. So Eloqua is an ideal opportunity for you to use Eloqua to run some campaigns, be proactive, and reinforce, the trust in your brand, whether or not you're operating in Europe, and keep them informed of these changes and what's happening and what you're doing about it, and just keeping them ahead of the curve. So if you are making changes, let your customers know. If you're making changes to the way that you're using forms, if the way you're collecting things, make those changes, let them know why you're making those changes, and it's all part of this kind of alignment. Obviously, if you are part of the GDPR or if that's a major component of your business, then that's even more important because people are going to be expecting it. And so a major way of kind of building that trust is to let people know that all of those types of things that fall within the regulations are important to you as a brand, and build that trust, build that understanding so that you're then able to communicate. And a big component of that is as an ideal opportunity to have a look and update your preference center. Whether that's right now sitting as an opt-out, a global unsubscribe link, or whether you've got some subscription preferences in place and subscription opt-ins, opt-outs. What we really want to do is take that and evolve that into understanding what the preferences are of the people that we are communicating to. And so a well-structured preference center will really help you to deal with kind of that right to access, the right to be informed, the right to correct my information, the right to object to email marketing. So a lot of those things can be covered off. So we work with a lot of our customers and provide sort of that advice kind of around how to best build a preference center based on where you are. But really both from a UX perspective as well as kind of the impacts that those changes are going to have throughout the platform. So I think it's kind of a really critical area and a critical opportunity to really start to understand and build a preference center that has a great kind of look and feel that also enables you to understand what it is and how your contacts, wherever they are in their customer life cycle, how they'd like to be communicated and what they would like to hear about. So more timely, more relevant communications. The legal side of things, we really want to make sure we cover that off. Again, particularly important with the European, but even outside, it's a good time to have a look and relook at your privacy policy. Look at what your terms of disclosure are. Look and see if you are being transparent with the way that the data is being used and how you're storing it, and particularly around personal data. And then include links and make that privacy policy clear and available. So make it available from the website, obviously, but make it clearly available from potentially the privacy center, from your emails, so it's included in sort of subscription forms. And also your opt-in terms and conditions. So what you'll see is lots of changes in kind of that language around kind of, if you tick this box and what it means, and a bit more transparency around that. So some more specific clauses, and it'll be good to see some of these. They'll be coming out of Europe. You'll see them already, but to see some of the ways that people are now managing those opt-ins and the way that they're disclosing it, so that you can then, I guess, get some ideas. But ultimately, it's a legal question. So in the first instance, a legal question in terms of what, as an organization, do you need to do, and how are you going to manage those opt-ins to say that if we get asked, we're legally compliant. And then secondarily, it's kind of what are our customers' expectations and our contacts' expectations, and how do we build trust, and how do we remain compliant with that, and really clear about what that data and what it means if you tick that box. What does it mean you're entitled to, or what you're likely to get, how the data is going to be used, just so that is easy and not kind of it's not buried away and hidden. So I spoke briefly about Germany having double opt-in already. So Eloqua caters for single opt-in and double opt-in processes. So you can do this, and you can use Eloqua to automate a double opt-in process, and you can use a program canvas and a campaign canvas, reminder emails to do it. So it's easy to kind of set these processes up, but it's a good time to consider whether a double opt-in is something that you want to do and something that you want to that you want to adopt. And the other thing to consider is the proof of the storage. You've got an opt-in. The double opt-in enables you to sort of click the link to verify to get sent. You submit your form, and then you get requested to go to your email and click the link in the email to verify. So basically, you're verifying that that email is in fact that email, and you've got two opt-ins. Basically, you've got the click of the form submit, and you've also got the email click verification. The question then is, what do you do with that proof? There's a couple of different ways. So Eloqua is already going to store the click on the link, and it's also going to store the form information, and it's possible to go back in and obviously pull that report and say, okay, here is the record of you opting in. Or conversely, what we have heard people are doing is putting that data and storing it into a custom data object, and including things like the opt-in source, the timestamp of the opt-in, and the confirmation. So we're just recording all of that information just to make it more accessible and stored, and that then information could also be potentially synced across into other databases or into the CRM. DOI is going to be considered really best practice under the GDPR, but also we need to consider that proof of how we're going to store that proof of opt-in, because if we're called upon, to have to produce it, then we want it to be accessible, and we want it to be recorded in a way that that we can produce it. So there's some considerations there. Okay, so I've covered quite a bit of this already in terms of collecting those opt-ins. So there are a number of mechanisms which you can store opt-ins and subscriptions. They can then be integrated into CRM or data warehouse for sharing more broadly across your organization. But there's a few other things you should also consider. The first of those is adding a country on your form to your list of required fields. Because as I said before, we know that we may well have contacts that are in the EU, but we don't know specifically what country they're from. So we want to add that country list to our required fields list, and again, we're going to see this a lot because every organization is going to need to know if they're dealing with a contact from the EU. So I mentioned including a link on your privacy policy when requesting an opt-in, setting up DOI campaigns, adding a link to your preference center, maybe making things obvious from your website, so link to your preference center, and adding pop-up forms potentially to your website, again, with links to that preference center. So we're collecting those, giving lots of opportunity to collect the opt-ins, also lots of opportunity to update that information, and also to explain what the data is being used for. Number 6, legitimate interest. So this was the concept that the GDPR kind of contains, and here's a quote from the DMA. It basically says, if a business decides to use the legitimate interest precedent for their direct marketing, then it'll be able to send email marketing on an unsubscribe or opt-out basis. It's important to know that all other aspects of the GDPR must be met, and if challenged, you have to prove a legitimate interest. I guess the read on that is you can do it, but it may be harder. So consent is your best way. Legitimate interest might establish a legal and legitimate compliant way of sending an email, but it's harder. So you need to think about the context for that email and need to prove that legally it was in the best interests of the recipient. So it's kind of a blurry one, and maybe one that you will need to run past maybe your legal team and make sure that they're comfortable if that is the basis upon which you're proceeding with a campaign. The easiest is the opted in and to have that clearly stated. Again, some good considerations even outside the EU, because again, this is going to be something that's going to be coming. Another area is our third-party compliance. Lots of information may be passed to third parties and coming back from third parties. So again, another consideration is what are the third-party tools that access your marketing technology and your broader technology infrastructure that may have personal data that may be stored and processed. And so again, if you're heading towards GDPR compliance, then you need to consider that personal data, how it's being stored, and making sure that those third parties are also GDPR compliant. I want to touch briefly on events. Obviously, a lot of people are running events in Eloqua, and so major consideration here is what's the extent of opt-in at the point of running a campaign. So we need to have evidence that people have opted in to campaigns if you want to market to them post-event. And you have to make sure that you're asking for that consent on the event registration form so that it's nice and clear what people have opted in for and the communications that they're going to get as a result of attending an event, even potentially such as this. Finally, I wanted to call out CRM because I think this is very important interplay between Eloqua and your CRM. And so there is a need, a very real need, to have that integration, especially if sales are going to be updating preferences and opt-in information or adding people to potentially to your Eloqua database via the CRM. So need to think about that. You also need to think about a process for how you're going to deal with forgetting contacts or the right to be forgotten. So how are you going to delete personal data on a record rather than going through a concept of having sort of inactive or do not contact? We need to have an explicit way of managing deletion. And your CRM integration, obviously, with Eloqua is also going to be key to managing preferences and opt-ins. So last one I wanted to touch on, and that is importing and exporting contacts. So you have to think about this really carefully because, the way you add new contacts into Eloqua, especially kind of spreadsheets, business cards, other ways that data gets added, we need to understand what people's opinion is or what they think that they've consented to at that point, and then conversely understand what that means from a marketing perspective we can do with those contacts, with that information. And also, you'll need to consider how you then distribute form submission data or other reports that might come from Oracle Marketing Cloud. So who do they go to, and who's getting that information? What information is contained within those reports? And if that's going to be, is that going to the right people? Is that data being looked after? And finally, you need to look at how data may be exported. So obviously, one of the clear ways that there could be data coming out of Eloqua is if somebody has the right and the ability to export it and exports that data, and then does something silly with it, like leave it somewhere or send it somewhere that it shouldn't be sent. So controlling exports is important. So that starts really with your internal policies around how that data should be stored, and then who has the right to export that information. Obviously, Eloqua does have the ability to kind of audit those changes as well as being able to control who can export, say, reports or data, and what access levels they have to have, who has done those exports at that time. So there were a couple of myths that we had heard. First one is, I've got an NDA, so I'm covered. So just, off the bat, kind of having NDAs, completely separate kind of agreement, doesn't really cover you at all. Confidentiality isn't kind of a magic solution for all the regulations. So yes, you may have an NDA in place, but it's not really going to protect you at the end of the day. You need to have all of the rest of these things covered if you're going to be GDPR compliant. The second myth was that online identifiers such as cookies, device-related data isn't included in personal data. So as I said earlier, it's not correct. They are considered personal data, are covered by the GDPR. There are, all those consent requirements that we spoke about earlier need to be included. Even for a cookie, consent has to be freely given. Data controllers, as they're called in the GDPR, that are kind of processing activities, they're kind of, that consent needs to be named. The transparency of the process has to be there. We have to disclose who owns the cookies and identify who that is. And then we have to have all our trusted parties that are kind of working together to make that information transparent and readily available. And there's also a myth in the EU, and that is that the EU data needs to be stored in the EU. So just to say out of the bat, you can definitely store data outside the EU, but you need to be aware if you're transferring data out of the EU, that there may be some data transfer restrictions. So within your own organization, you can absolutely store the data. That data needs to be GDPR compliant if you're communicating within the EU. Now, the last quick poll, and that is just a quick question on how ready do you think you are for the GDPR? So come the 28th of May, where do you think you are? Do you think it doesn't really apply to you? Do you think you're ready for it and sitting in a good place, learning but could be better, or you think you might need some help? Cool. Okay. Well, that's awesome. So I think there's still a bit to learn, but people are feeling relatively confident. Some people are obviously got some of this well entrained, which is good, and some people are looking for a little bit of help to make sure that they are GDPR compliant. So again, thank you everyone for some of those responses. That's excellent. Just in terms of kind of where to from here, we've actually prepared a white paper on the GDPR that will be released next week, kind of probably via the Marketing Cube blog, together with all the references for this presentation, all the detail behind this presentation, so as well as a replay. But if you don't watch the replay and you want to get something a little bit more legible, readable, then please have a look at that white paper, and that will kind of share a little bit more with you on this topic. And we're also going to run a broader webinar potentially for the non-Eloqua or non-user group members in the next couple of weeks. So if you missed out or you feel there's some people that could have benefited from seeing this, don't want to watch the replay and would like to watch that webinar, then please let them know and we'll share the details. I think I'm going to go back just in conclusion very quickly. I think that for domestic marketers in Australia and New Zealand, those not operating kind of in the EU, the GDPR and that whole process that is evolving really presents all of us with an opportunity to improve data quality and just make sure that all of our contacts are well informed about the use of the data. So, really that's going to help us with better segmentation, make better campaign decisions, deliver more timely and relevant communications. And ultimately, I think that's going to drive increased click-through rates and engagement and probably better results. That's something that obviously we're very passionate about. If we can help in terms of how to do that, then please just let us know. But I'd like to just finish off finally by thanking you again very much for attending and for your participation in the polls and for all, for being part of the webinar today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Eloqua user group. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.